On Monday, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the Russian Defense Ministry to deploy troops into pro-Moscow territories in Ukraine, escalating what could evolve into the largest military conflict since the Second World War. As the United States and its European allies put forth sanctions on Russia, it needs to be wary of a geopolitical threat looming in the background: China. What is Beijing thinking, seeing the Moscow-Ukraine crisis unfold? Will supporting Ukraine distract the United States military presence in the Indo-Pacific? Is Putin talking to Xi Jinping? And how does the February 4th joint statement by Russia and China play into this? Today we sit down with Dr. Anders Corr, geopolitical expert and author of The Concentration of Power, to talk about the crisis unfolding in Eastern Europe and how this might change the landscape among the United States, China, and Ukraine. This is Forbidden News, and I'm Gary Bai. Dr. Anders Corr, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
So, you have worked on quite a few national security risk analysis for the United States military, and you've done work for both the Pacific Special, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Pacific Special Operations and the United States European Command. And sort of what transpired on the eastern borders of Ukraine yesterday really kind of falls squarely in your field of expertise. So as of the recording of this episode, Vladimir Putin has recognized the independence of pro-Russian territories, proceeded to order the deployment of troops in the separatist regions and Western countries, have put forth sanctions. So your reflections on the big picture here.
Well, Putin just invaded Ukraine, the sovereign territory of Ukraine, violated its territorial integrity, violated his promises in the Minsk Accords, the Budapest Agreement. He's been lying essentially right up to the end, claiming that he's not planning to invade, and then, of course, last night he does it. So the response of the international community is very swift. There will be, and there are being imposed economic sanctions on Russia, Russian individuals who are involved. And there's a lot of push, I think, from the parliaments of the European countries to increase sanctions significantly. The other issue here is that it's pulling attention away from the China issue, which is because China is 10 times more powerful economically by GDP than Russia, and its military expansion is much quicker than Russia, and it arguably has a lot of influence over Russia in terms of, because Russia sells massive quantities of oil and gas to China, so it has that client relationship. China arguably is the bigger threat, but what's happening with this very public invasion and military exercises that have turned into an invasion is that people are getting distracted from that bigger threat, I think. And I think we are already seeing this in the British Parliament, actually today, live, as the British discussion of the situation. And they're already saying that they are, they're justifying essentially the focus on the Atlantic and Europe as opposed to an Indo-Pacific tilt, which is the other option. To think about Europe and the United States together balancing against China's rising threat. So that's the big picture, I would say.
And so I kind of want to zoom in on China here, because this is an underreported aspect of this entire conflict. So China is definitely a strategically important consideration for Washington, but some would argue that China is in quite a bit of a tough position here. This happened at the time when Russia and China are kind of being forced together by external pressures from liberal democratic countries. And analysts say that Beijing doesn't want its relationship with Washington to become even more hostile than it already is. And some are saying that China is conflicted on its sovereignty narrative on Ukraine. And some are even speculating that it's eyeing on Taiwan as this crisis unfolds. So from Beijing's perspective, what are they thinking?
Well, I think China does definitely have its eye on Taiwan. China will be watching what we do, what Russia does in terms of Ukraine, as a lesson that it can take home in terms of its strategy for Taiwan. So I think that if we don't truly punish Russia in a serious way, we will be giving the green light to China to do the same thing to Taiwan. At the same time, we can't let China off the hook in this current conflict. China has been encouraging Russia, I think, in this direction for a long time. It certainly hasn't been vocal in opposition to what Russia is doing, and it had many chances to do that behind the scenes or not. It certainly isn't imposing economic sanctions on Russia for the violation of the territorial integrity of another country. So I think actually that what Russia is doing today is very much in China's interest. If Russia and NATO get into a conflict, and Europe and the United States and Russia are weakened because of this, it essentially opens up a path for China and the Chinese Communist Party more specifically to seek the global hegemony that it wants. It's very clear that the CCP is seeking global hegemony. Rosh Doshi has written a book on it called The Long Game, which I recommend that everyone read. It's Oxford University Press. This conflict with Russia, between Russia, Ukraine, NATO, the United States, and allies, fits very well into that plan. I'm not saying it was pre-planned in that way, but I do think it fits very well. And I do think if you look back over recent history between Russia and China, including the signing recently of a joint document that seems to support Russia's claims, and that in terms of being anti-NATO and anti-NATO expansion, I think you'll see that China actually has a hand, complicity in Russia's invasion of Ukraine that fits with its long-term goals.
Right. So, and you covered a little bit of China's, perspective here. But from this perspective of the United States, should, in the scenario that it would be forced to deploy its armed forces in Eastern Europe, what would that look like? I mean, it's already got, I think, some air forces in Poland from the last time that I checked. So what would further escalation of military deployment look like?
Well, I think that the United States is going to avoid military escalation over Ukraine. I think we had the opportunity, we might still barely have the opportunity to put troops into Ukraine in order to protect that territory from an invasion. Whoever has their troops in a territory first decreases the likelihood of an invasion, I think, quite significantly. But it also increases the risk, because if there is an invasion, you could end up with a militarized conflict between the U.S. and Russia, for example, which has huge repercussions and threats that it entails. But given that we didn't put troops in the ground, which I previously advocated, I don't see that we're going to be putting troops in the ground now. What I do think we're going to do is continue what we have done, which was supply the Ukrainians with shoulder-fired Stinger missiles that can take down airplanes, and shoulder-fired Javelin anti-tank missiles that can take out tanks and other armored tracked vehicles that the Russians are already flowing into Donetsk and Luhansk, the eastern part of Ukraine that is rebel controlled. Now, the big question, I think, is whether those tanks will then proceed further into the entire provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, or whether they might even go to the Dnieper River, which cuts through Kiev, or whether they would go and try to take the whole country. The country is very large. It's the size of Afghanistan, almost. When the United States had 100,000 troops in Afghanistan, we had a very hard time holding it. And the Taliban did not have these shoulder-fired weapons that could take out tanks and airplanes. The Ukrainians will have shoulder-fired weapons. The Russians are not going to have that many more troops than we had, if you include our contractors and our international troops that added to our 100,000. And so I think it's going to be very hard for Russia to hold this territory. They will be able to take Kiev and hold it. They will be able to take the big cities and hold them. But I think they're going to have a hard time controlling all of the countryside. And so it could be a very long and protracted and bloody conflict if Russia actually decides to go deeper than it has. As soon as they pass the controlled regions that the rebels previously controlled, I would expect these shoulder-fired weapons to be used against their vehicles and their planes. So we'll see what happens, and if you add to that the massive financial sanctions that will be taken against them. Already, they've lost Nord Stream 2, which is the gas pipeline. There's going to be heavy sanctions right at the get-go already against individuals, oligarchs, their money that's held in London, Paris, elsewhere. What Putin has done is a major mistake, a major strategic mistake for the Russian people. He's apparently revanchist, revisionist, trying to go turn back the dial of history to get back to the Soviet Union or what teeny scraps of the old Soviet Union he could find on some of the borders of Russia. It's a very, very short-sighted perspective and strategy and tactic. He's pushing 80. He's getting older. I'm not sure that he's thinking straight. As a dictator, the people he surrounds him with are likely yes men who want to curry favor with him, and they're going to tell him what he wants to hear, which is probably that he can succeed and take back Ukraine. He just needs to push the button, which he appears to be doing at this point.
Yeah, I think I saw this recording of him meeting with his security council yesterday, and he was sitting there like an elementary school teacher, and his generals, I don't think they were even provided a desk. Like they were just sitting there in front of him, and he was questioning them on live TV one by one and saying, asking basically their opinion on Ukraine. And obviously, this is sort of like a forced confession, right? They would be they would be obviously talking, in favor of Putin because otherwise it would look kind of bad on them. So do you think that's a way that sort of says that's how Putin justifies his action towards Ukraine? Say, hey, it's not only me but all my ministers, which he can extrapolate to the Russian people and whatnot.
Absolutely, by putting them on TV like that, he's getting their complicity there. He's engaging them as co-conspirators, as it will, in this violence against another territory. And of course, they couldn't say no, or they could have, but they would have been out of a job or worse. So yeah, I mean, it's a tragedy, and this is what happens with dictatorships. They make very bad decisions. They force people to go along with them. And then they often fail because of it. That's the danger for Putin. And I think, he's basically been told by the Western world, leaders in the Western world, that he's making a mistake, that the consequences are going to be severe in blood and treasure, and he will not survive as leader of Russia. It's a tragedy for him personally because he could have just rested on his laurels and maintained his position in Moscow essentially forever until he dies. But what he's doing now is he's risking it all for Ukraine, which is and what he's got planned for Ukraine in terms of
right. And from what you said, previously, I kind of wanted to bring up a commentary piece published on Wall Street Journal, and it says strategically Taiwan is as vital, as a part of the first island chain of the Western Pacific, and the U.S. military deployment in Eastern Europe would involve major additional tactical resources in air, in space, in naval and logistic forces to go along. So, how much, in your opinion, is this a distraction from the United States Indo-Pacific commitments?
I think it's a huge distraction, and I think it's going to distract our allies in Europe. No one wants to take on the bigger bully China instead of the smaller bully Putin. But at the same time, we have to defend every inch of democratic territory, and we have to also think of, I think, Putin as a bit of a proxy for Xi Jinping in the same way that I think we should think about the Taliban as proxies for Xi Jinping. Taliban were being directly supported by Pakistan. Pakistan was being heavily supported, billions of dollars, by China. And so we need to think about these conflicts as very interrelated. We shouldn't give up an inch of territory in Ukraine, in Afghanistan, over Taiwan, in the South China Sea, in the Senkakus. These are all related, and when you give up an inch in one place, all the dictators and autocrats and terrorists in the other place start licking their chops, and they want to grab some territory of their own. So we have to be much tougher, both economically, which I think we are readily doing, but also militarily. We have to put our troops on the line. We have to draw red lines, and we have to say if you take Taiwan, we're going to fight. The United States and our allies are going to fight. If you take Ukraine, we're going to fight. I think if we had done that before Putin invaded, that he wouldn't have invaded, because he doesn't want to risk a war with the United States and NATO. But unfortunately, we have not been willing to take that risk for that moral cause and for that. I think it's a very strategic approach that ultimately ends up with peace. It's the approach of peace through strength instead of peace through gradually backing off, which is what we're essentially doing in Ukraine right now.
Right, and I kind of wanted to ask about, so we covered China's side and we covered a little bit of Kremlin, their perspective. So I kind of wanted to ask about Washington's actions and what your thoughts are about the sanctions they imposed so far. So as of yesterday, they've imposed sanctions on both separatist regions in the eastern Ukraine border. And I heard on online news today that they are going to impose the sanctions. They're going to impose sanctions on Russia itself. So how do you see the situation here? What do you think President Biden is going to do, and what's his considerations here with Ukraine, involving Russia and China?
Well, I think that the idea with the sanctions is to hold off on the heaviest sanctions as a threat to make sure that Putin doesn't really invade a large swath of Ukrainian territory, whether that's the full provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, or whether that's all the way to Dnieper or all of Ukraine. Already you have diplomatic personnel from Lviv, which is in the far west of the country, have already evacuated to Poland. So there is a concern by the United States that Putin could actually invade the whole country very quickly. It could happen in a day or two. His troops could do a blitzkrieg, a lightning strike that takes Kiev, that takes Lviv in a very short period of time. So what they're doing with the sanctions is they're holding off with the most powerful sanctions, which are, for example, denying Russia the ability to use U.S. dollars or pound sterling in their international sales. So a lot of contracts, oil and gas contracts around the world that Russia will have been denominated in U.S. dollars or pound sterling. He knows that we're going to do this, and so he has been preparing by renegotiating his contracts into euros. Unfortunately, the European Union is not taking as tough a stand through sanctions on Russia, and they have not said that they would disallow the use of euros for international transfers. The other thing that we could do that is really the nuclear option for international financial sanctions is kicking Russia out of the SWIFT network, which is an interbank transfer system globally. If we kick them out of SWIFT, it would be basically it shuts down their entire economy and its relationship to banking internationally. This would make it very difficult for them to transfer, export oil and gas and the other things that they export. The final option is we can do secondary sanctions on countries that are doing business with Russia. So, for example, we could sanction China for importing oil and gas from Russia. That would also have a huge effect if we did something like that.
Right. So on the big picture here, how, in your opinion, should the United States structure its policies towards Russia and China now? Which one of these autocracies, and both are now closer to a dictatorship, pose a larger threat to the United States?
Well, I think China is the bigger threat, and I always use that metric of GDP. China's GDP is almost or approximately 10 times bigger than Russia's GDP. People have called Russia Côte d'Ivoire with nuclear weapons. Yes, it has a lot of nuclear weapons and it has a fairly decent military, but it doesn't match up to China's economic power. And China uses that economic power not only to build its military, which has a massive number of personnel and a massive potential number of personnel because it's such a large country by population. But China is able to use that economic power for influence, political influence around the world. So essentially, they're able to bribe politicians. They're able to, whether that's directly by giving them bags of cash, or they're able to bribe them through promises of aid, loans, cheap loans, nice repayments to schedules. But the truth is that these loans that they give around the world through the Belt and Road Initiative are often very, very opaque. We don't know what's in them. The people in the country that's taking them don't know what's in them. Who knows are the president and the finance minister, who may very well have been paid off by China with these bags of cash. So they've got tremendous power. They know how to wield it. They know how to use it. In a way, I think that Moscow is not doing. And in fact, I think that more likely Moscow is so much under the thumb of Beijing that it is doing Beijing's bidding, which is what makes me think that in the current case of the invasion of Ukraine, it is so not in the interests of Russia to do this at this point, to make itself an international pariah and focus of the world's attention, that it makes me suspect that it's possible that Beijing had asked Putin to do this or encouraged Putin to do this in some way. So I think we have to consider that as a possibility. And I think if you see even the debate in the British Parliament recently that's just happened today, you already see them using this as a justification for their focus on Europe and their focus on the Atlantic, as opposed to the alternative, which is an Indo-Pacific tilt. However, they are saying that they should be increasing their defense spending to 2 to 3%, which will be able to be used in many different ways, not only to deter Russia, but potentially to join the United States in deterring China from an invasion of Taiwan, for example. And the other thing that we need to consider is for example, we're in the process of giving Australia access to nuclear propulsion technology for their submarines. We need to consider giving a nuclear deterrent, an independent nuclear deterrent, to the frontline democracies that are facing off against countries like China and Russia. So Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in the 90s for a promise of its territorial integrity from the United States, UK, and Moscow. Of course, Moscow is immediately reneging on that promise, and in a way the United States and UK, by backing out of the country, are also reneging on that promise, unfortunately. I think we're trying to do with financial sanctions, what our boots on the ground would have done. But if we're in the process, we're really risking the Ukrainian people because Putin could easily move his troops into all of Ukraine, and it would lead to a massive and bloody battle that would destroy the country. And those are democratic people who want to join the European Union. They want to join NATO, and in a way, we're risking all of those people with our failure to have boots on the ground and really protect them with our own troops. And I think that in a way we're doing the same thing with the Taiwan people right now by leaving them a bit out on the limb, where we don't even call them Taiwan. We don't call them a sovereign country. I think these things have to change. We have to be much more committed to the defense of democracies around the world, whether or not they're in our alliance systems. We have to integrate them into our alliance systems more rapidly. And we need to show the dictators of the world that we are ready to fight in the defense of democracy. We are willing to risk our own lives and our own treasure for this. We can't just let them pick us off one at a time, because ultimately, as soon as they pick off Taiwan or Ukraine, they become more powerful. They get all of the resources, all of the people that are in those countries, and we get less powerful because they're no longer available as allies. Their trading systems are no longer available to us. Their financial help when we need them for a conflict, for a pandemic, their industrial ecosystem is no longer available. So every time a dictator takes a little democracy around the world, our own security is harmed in a very serious way. Not least because our reputation is harmed. We're seen as an unreliable ally when we don't stand up for a country like Taiwan, for a country like the Philippines, which has lost some islands to China recently in the South China Sea, when we don't stand up for Ukraine, with whom we have a treaty, essentially guaranteeing their territorial integrity. So we have to stand by our word, or we will lose the good reputation of reliability and strength that we've had from winning the World War II and from winning the Cold War against the Soviets.
So, on what you kind of talked about here, it kind of goes along with a theme in your book, The Concentration of Power, by I think it's published by Optimum Publishing International, in which you kind of talk about hegemonic powers as black holes that attracts powers around them, and China is a great example for this, where they are essentially exporting their influence across the world. So can you talk a little bit about what you think about the China threat in the big picture here?
Well, China's economy has grown so quickly that by one measure, GDP, purchasing power parity, which is how much you can actually buy with your money, how much bread you can get, how much steel you can get, how many ships you can build. By that measure, China surpassed the United States and the European Union years ago. It's the biggest economy in the world by that measure, and it has control over that economy in a way that is much more than, say, the President Biden has over the U.S. economy, or definitely more than the European Union president has over the EU's economy. So that is a concentration of power in Beijing that's quite remarkable. It's a bigger concentration of power in the world than we've ever seen in history. And I would argue that there's an aggregative effect of that power. And I think we see that by essentially Beijing being able to pull strings around the world, pull a string and Putin invades Ukraine, pull a string and, the United States and Britain refocus on the Atlantic relationship and Russia, as opposed to the bigger threat in Beijing. And I think that what you're seeing in this conflict is you're seeing Beijing essentially coming out of it high and dry after the Beijing Winter Olympics, really trying to burnish its image there. and to totally distract the world from what it was focusing on just a month or two ago, which was the genocide that's happening in China, the threats of invasion against Taiwan, the expansion of artificial islands in the South China Sea, the daily, um, maritime fishing fleets, which is really militarized fishing fleets that are surrounding the Senkaku Islands of Japan, the takeover of chunks of the Himalayas from India by force, and also a small country called Bhutan that's lost some territory recently to China. Not to mention China's involvement in the genocide in Myanmar that against the Rohingya, and its lack of action against that, and also its support for the generals in Myanmar that just had a coup. So what we're seeing is around the world, we're seeing a concentration of power. That power is very, very illiberal, um, and unfortunately, things are starting to, gravitate around Beijing as the center of that power. So that's in a way why, while I do look on a global level, my expertise is sort of geopolitics globally. I do focus a lot on China just because Beijing is emerging as as a center of global power that we really have to take more seriously, and we just aren't. On a regular basis, we fail to take it seriously, and we keep getting surprised.
Well, let's hope that doesn't occur in the so far free democratic world for now. So thank you very much, Dr. Anders Corr, for your time today.
Thank you very much. Great to meet you.